This is why your clothes never fit. Even if you do most things right and you don't do this right, your clothes may never fit. Hey everyone, let's talk about seam allowances. What is a seam allowance? Seam allowance is the distance between the edge of your fabric and the stitch line. I'm going to show you on the fabric. You know, when you take a measurement and when you want to make a project like a tote bag, and you know the size of a tote bag is like at about 14 inches, then you stop at 14 inches line. The extra inch you measure is what is called seam allowance. So the stitch line is so on it, but the space between the stitch line and the edge of the fabric is your seam allowance. Now, understanding seam allowance is the most important skill when it comes to sewing. Yes. Okay? Because if you don't put the right seam allowance, your project might not come out mm, neatly or come out well, it might not fit properly. Now, this small space may seem less important, but it plays a vital role in how your garment or how your project turns out. Now, I'm going to list down some problems that may occur if you don't use the correct and right seam allowance when making your project. The first one is that your project may become too small. Yes, let's say you want to sew a 14-inch tote bag, then you just measure exactly 14 inch, cut on if you cut on the 14 inches. Where will you sew on? Then you'll be forced to sew in and it won't give you the result you're looking for. And also the same thing when you're sewing a skirt, the hip is 35, you measure exactly 35 without an extra inch or half inch for you to sew on is going to affect the fit of your project. It's going to become too small. The second problem may occur is the garments may become too large. Yes, this occurs when you take a seam allowance. Yes, you measure your project, your pattern, whatever you are making. You know it is 15 inch. You decide to add a 1 inch seam allowance to it. And while you're sewing, instead of to sew on your seam allowance line, your stitched line, you move a bit. Let's say you left a 1 inch seam allowance. You decide to sew with an half-inch seam allowance. What will happen to that garment? What will happen to that project? It becomes too big. So that's another the second problem you that might occur when you don't use the right seam allowance or when you don't sew on the seam allowance. The third one is the pattern piece may not fit. Yes, if you use different seam allowance for each pattern piece. Like in the basic bodies, we have the back pattern and the front pattern. Okay, so and the back pattern, you decide to just add a 1 inch seam allowance. Then the front pattern, you decide to add an half-inch seam allowance. It will fit. They won't align. Now you're trying to sew a half-inch on a 1 inch. It's just like putting a square peg in a round hole. It will not fit. So you need to take note when making any project. Make sure the two pieces you are joining together carry the same seam allowance. The fourth problem that may occur is uneven seam allowances. Yes. Now, what does uneven seam allowance do? It makes your project look unprofessional. It makes your project look not neat. Yeah, so what do? Whatever seam allowance you put on one part, let's say you're making the basic bodies, for basic bodies we have the bust measurement, the waist measurement, the hip measurement, and other measurement. And on the bust line, you added a 1 inch seam allowance. You should add the same seam allowance on the waist and on the hip. Yes. So you add the same one everywhere. Don't add maybe one on bust, 1.5 on the waist, two on the hip. Everything has to be the same. It has to be even. So your sewing project doesn't look unprofessional, doesn't look untidy. The next one, the next one is fraying at the seams. If you use too little seam allowance to sew, your fabric may start fraying. It will fray and fray into the your stitch line, and your stitch line will become weak and your clothes or your project may rip apart and you wouldn't like that. So try as much as possible not to use too little seam allowance or too much seam allowance. Yes, because if you use too much seam allowance, your garment may become bulky. It won't lay on your body. It will become too bulky. So what do you do? Use the correct seam allowances. Use the correct seam allowances. Don't make it too big, neither make it too small. Now I'm going to show you a little demonstration of everything I have been talking about. Let's go to the sewing machine. So I have a fabric here. So I'm assuming that this is a tote bag or anything. I'm assuming this is my project. And the width I want for this project so is about 8 inches. So I'm going to measure 8 inches all through. Then I connect it with a ruler. So this is the width of my project. Now I want to mark out my seam allowance. How many inch? I want to use a 1 inch seam allowance. Now from the edge of your stitch line, from the edge of the width of your project, you measure out. Let's use a 1 inch. It's a 1 inch seam allowance all through the same 1 inch all through. So I'll also connect this with my ruler. Now, what do? You cut out this excess. Don't leave it. If you leave it, it's going to make your project bulky. Okay? Cut it out. So this is my project stitch line, and this is the seam allowance. Then you can now sew on this line. So let's start sew. Now I have my exact measurement, what I needed. 8, and I still have space. This space between this and this is my seam allowance. Hope you've learned something from this video. I'm sure you have because this video is packed with so much lesson. Thank you for watching. If this video helped you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who is learning how to sew. And I'll see you in the next lesson on Sewing Zoba.